Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We just talked about the biggest threats in the NBA for the reigning champion Boston Celtics. And one of the teams that immediately comes to mind when you ask that question is the Milwaukee Bucks. And I still do feel like that is the case, but early on so far in this offseason, it has been very quiet for Milwaukee. And it's not really instilling a ton of confidence in a Bucks fan base that has seen back-to-back first-round exits the past couple of years. Now, obviously, injuries are the number one reason for that being the case. Missing Giannis for the entirety of last year's playoff series, mixed in with some Damian Lillard injuries as well. And then in 2023, Giannis missing over half of their first-round series against Miami. So I don't want to make it seem like the Bucks are any type of failure because they haven't made it back to, the finals or conference finals in these past handful of years. They have been very unlucky, which you can absolutely acknowledge, and then acknowledge the fact that this offseason, where it does seem like there is some level of pressure on the Bucks, they haven't done anything to really impact the season outlook for the year to come. Now, again, a lot of people were ready to just entirely write off the Bucks last season. I was never really on board with that. The Bucks were going to be a 2 seed in the East. They were beating up on the Celtics in a game in early April to win their 48th game when Giannis went down with that calf strain. And again, the fact that they had only won 48 games up to that point did feel like a little bit of a letdown, but we also, in the beginning of the season, were talking about the fact that the Bucks were really good under Adrian Griffin and that they didn't play a style of basketball specifically on the defensive end that was going to be successful in the postseason. So I don't think their year should be judged on wins and losses because of the fact that even when they were winning, it still didn't feel like it was enough there. So I defend the Bucks more than the average person does, I feel like, to some degree on that note. I don't think the Bucks were ever going to beat the Celtics in a playoff series, but I think they could have beat just about everybody else. And I'm not saying they would have, but they definitely could have. And instead, they end up getting eliminated in the first round by Indiana because they're dealing with all of these injuries. And now, again, the excitement level does feel pretty low for Milwaukee. Now, that being said, we're headed into year 2 of Giannis and Lillard, and it wasn't quite as dominant last season as we were maybe expecting it to be, but at the same time, it does take a lot of adjustment here when you're talking about pairing up two players who, for their entire careers, have been, Giannis obviously took some developmental years, but once he was actually arrived, there was no looking back. He was the undisputed number one. And, I think that it also gets a little bit more complicated the deeper you dive into this specific situation with Milwaukee. There's, of course, the story that Doc Rivers told on the Bill Simmons podcast about how Damian Lillard came into the season out of shape because he was worried about getting injured before being traded and such. And I do feel like we saw some of the repercussions of that. The fact that he would be great, twice a week, but he would have some pretty mediocre games in that stretch as well. Again, I think the consistency of playing week in, week out, every day did sort of catch up to him a little bit. So he should be back to being a conditioned version of himself next year, and that alone is going to be a difference maker. But also, outside of that alone, Lillard spent 11 years of his career being the number one option for the Trailblazers, and then he had to sort of adjust to being the second option just like that on the fly with very little training camp. I think that Lillard actually got traded just before training camp, but it was pretty late into the summer that took place, and ultimately, he wasn't at his peak version of himself, which also kind of hurts the chemistry that him and Giannis were able to build up. And like I said, these things don't happen overnight. We just saw Luka and Kyrie make a run to the finals based off of, for the most part, just the stellar play of the two of them. You give more credit to Luka, but you understand where I'm coming from. He couldn't have done it without Kyrie Irving and some of his performances along the way. And they were a sub 500 team together when Kyrie was traded to Dallas during the second half of the 2023 regular season. Now, smaller sample size there, but again, you get the point. It's not like we're playing NBA 2K on franchise mode and just putting players next to one another and expecting them to both shine. That these things sometimes take time, and that's something that I'm putting a lot of stock into this upcoming season with Lillard and Giannis. And I was feeling even better about the Bucks until this offseason sort of played out. Now, I'm not going to let it entirely diminish all of this praising of the Bucks core that have sort of been, spewing out here, but during the draft, they took two 19-year-olds in A.J. Johnson and Tyler Smith, where the likelihood of either one of them getting any type of significant minutes is just about 0%, especially on a team that's coached by Doc Rivers, who showed last season he had very little interest in developing youth talent at this point in his career and at this point in the stage of the Milwaukee Bucks, where they think that they are championship contenders, at least from the perspective of giving them actual meaningful minutes. But, sometimes those late firsts, early seconds in the NBA draft can be a little bit overrated. Obviously, as basketball fans, we all get excited about the what ifs, and just about every prospect has some sort of, well, what if this plays out? And you can talk yourself into just about anybody, but I do think that there were legitimately guys that could have gotten playing time and not just been another one of these people we get hooked on for a couple weeks and then a couple years from now we end up forgetting about them. I thought there were a couple of options for them. Ryan Dunn out of Virginia, definitely flawed offensively, and that would have been a tough fit, especially next to Giannis maybe, in terms of the spacing of the fit there, but still would probably be the second best defender on the Bucks, just on their roster entirely by the end of the regular season. So that's somebody I would have liked to see them go after. You can make a case as well for Terrence Shannon Jr. out of Illinois, Baylor Shireman out of Creighton, or Kyle Filipowski out of Duke. Any one of them I think could have gotten 10 minutes a game maybe, at least in the regular season, and seen if it was going to translate to the playoffs. And I understand that the majority of the time, when you're looking at picks number 23 and 33 is what the Bucks held this past draft season, they typically don't pan out the majority of the time. But especially with their cap situation, they are likely going to be a second apron luxury tax team next year. I just feel like it would have been worth them at least trying to take some swings at potential rotational players, and instead we have very little idea. And you know what? If either one of them, specifically Tyler Smith, were drafted by a younger team where it feels like there isn't this win now timeline at hand, then I would like the picks a lot. It's not like I dislike the prospects. I just don't like the fit in terms of where the Bucks are currently at and what I wish they would have done with those selections. And that's just the draft. Again, we're talking about young players that typically don't have these massive impacts when the playoffs come around. But then in free agency, we've seen the only move they made was to pick up DeLon Wright, who, by the way, I do like. And I feel like, last year he was a midseason pickup for the Heat, and he was largely not impactful for the most part. I'd like to think that with a full training camp with the Bucks, that he could turn into a legitimate backup point guard option. I mean, DeLon Wright was all right. He had that hot shooting streak at one point in one of those games against the Celtics in the first round. So, I don't know. We'll see on DeLon Wright. But there's not very much motion happening here. And to be fair, they were pretty limited financially to even have that be the case in the first place, where they are already talking about $183 million that is currently committed to 10 players, and they're going to have to round out their roster as well on, veteran minimum deals. But I don't know if that's probably going to end up reaching over $189 million, which will be that second luxury tax cap. So it's definitely a tough position for the Bucks to be in. They have some rotational players from last year that they have to make decisions on, and Jay Crowder, Malik Beasley, Patrick Beverley. I feel like I'd probably like to see them go after Beverley just because of the defense. Defense is still one of my bigger concerns with this team, especially along the perimeter. I feel like the Jay Crowder took over in large part some of these bigger minutes when Doc Rivers became the head coach, and it sort of bumped Andre Jackson Jr. out of the rotation. But I would like to see Rivers try and incorporate him a little bit more, because I feel like he can be an important piece specifically from the defensive end on the perimeter from a wing that is going to be important to knock out the Celtics, the Knicks, and you can maybe even throw the 76ers in that conversation as well. But, again, not a lot of options for them. They can try and pull off a Brook Lopez or Chris Middleton deal maybe to dump off some expensive contracts. It would probably be Lopez, who has been in a number of different trade rumors. Giannis doesn't want to be a full-time starting center, so you'd have to find a replacement for him that is going to take a veteran minimum deal and not be a liability there. So I don't know. Ultimately, I'm not going to rule out the Bucks next year, but I see a lot of concerns. And again, Giannis is good enough, and as long as Dame is good enough too, this is going to be a team that's going to have home court advantage in the postseason. And the majority of the time we do see typically the team with the best player ends up winning in the NBA. So again, can't rule out Giannis and the Bucks, but I have my share of concerns. And I also have my share of concerns for another team in the Eastern Conference that had home court advantage in the postseason last year, and that is the Cleveland Cavaliers, where it seems like they are continuing to just move ahead with, we understand we have all of this talent on the roster right now. We're going to find a way to figure it out. And that has been the sentiment from the Cavaliers ownership group and their front office, and that was further solidified by them re-signing Donovan Mitchell to a max contract extension. So we're going to be diving into that deal, what it actually means, some underlying things to take a look at in that contract negotiation process, and whether or not the Cavaliers are going to be true threats next season. But we are going to have to take a quick break before we get into all of that. Don't go anywhere. We will be right back.